The screen fades to white. Quaid stands on Mars. The colony is saved, and yet something feels deeply off. For over 30 years, audiences have walked away asking the same question. Did any of it actually happen? What looks like a sci-fi action blockbuster is hiding something far more unsettling beneath the surface. Behind every chase and explosion lies a web of abandoned versions, near disasters, and clues planted by a director who never told the whole truth. These are the secrets buried inside one of Hollywood's strangest productions, and the first one begins exactly where the film ends. Number 1. Verhoeven's dark ending theory. The ending of Total Recall is one of cinema's great unsolved debates. As the screen fades to white and the music swells, director Paul Verhoeven has openly suggested that what audiences just watched may have been nothing more than an elaborate fantasy. The Rekall program working exactly as advertised. Quaid paid for a thrilling Mars adventure, complete with danger, romance, and heroism, and that is precisely what he got. The most chilling evidence appears in the Dr. Edgemar scene, where a man claiming to be a Rekall doctor confronts Quaid inside a hotel room. He tells him that he is trapped in a paranoid delusion and urges him to swallow a pill that will end the dream. It is a deeply unsettling moment, because if Edgemar is telling the truth, then everything the audience has believed up to that point is false. Then there is the final fade to white. Rather than a traditional blackout, the film ends in a burst of blinding light, a detail Verhoeven has hinted could represent the moment Quaid's mind is wiped clean by a failed recall procedure. Whether or not that reading is intentional, it has kept audiences arguing for decades. That ambiguity, many believe, is exactly the point. Number 2. The $1,000 story that started it. Before the Mars colony, before Schwarzenegger, before any of it, there was a short story and a very small check. In 1974, producer Ronald Shusett purchased the rights to Philip K. Dick's We Can Remember It For You wholesale for just $1,000. At the time, Dick was far from the Hollywood icon he would later become, and the deal raised few eyebrows. Nobody could have predicted that this modest purchase would eventually lead to one of the most expensive productions of its era. Screenwriter Dan O'Bannon was brought in early to help adapt the material into a feature film. The problem was that Dick's original tale was short and contained very little action. It was a sharp, psychological piece about identity and manufactured memory. O'Bannon struggled to stretch the story into a full screenplay and quickly found himself running out of ideas. The Mars setting, the rebellion, the mutants, almost none of it exists in Dick's original work. What the writers eventually created was essentially an original film built around one borrowed concept. What if a man could purchase fake memories of a vacation he never took? Everything else was invented from scratch. Ronald Shusett and later Gary Goldman spent years refining the script through multiple drafts before it finally reached the screen. That $1,000 investment ultimately produced a movie that grossed over $260 million worldwide. Number 3. Cronenberg's lost version of the film. Long before Paul Verhoeven stepped behind the camera, a very different filmmaker had the project in his hands. David Cronenberg spent nearly a year developing his own take on the material in the early 1980s. Known for his deeply unsettling explorations of the human body and the fragility of the mind, Cronenberg was drawn to the psychological core of the story rather than its action potential. His vision was darker, slower, and far more cerebral than what audiences eventually saw. His version reportedly leaned heavily into themes of memory, identity, and paranoia, ideas closer in spirit to a psychological thriller than a sci-fi blockbuster. Cronenberg discussed casting William Hurt in the lead role, which would have produced a very different kind of protagonist. Where Schwarzenegger brought physical power and raw charisma to the screen, Hurt would have brought introspection and fragility, qualities far better suited to a man who cannot trust his own mind. The project collapsed before a single frame was shot and Cronenberg moved on. Yet several of his ideas reportedly lingered in later drafts of the script. His departure remains one of Hollywood's more fascinating what-ifs, a version of the story faithful to Dick's psychological intent, built by a director uniquely suited to explore it. What audiences received instead was louder and more bombastic, but undeniably one of the defining sci-fi films of its decade. Number 4. The Patrick Swayze version. Schwarzenegger was not the only major star attached to the project before it finally got made. During one of the film's many stops and starts throughout the 1980s, Patrick Swayze was seriously considered for the lead role. Director Bruce Beresford was attached to helm the production during this period, and there were discussions about filming the entire movie in Australia. It would have been a radically different picture, leaner perhaps, and built around a very different kind of screen presence. Funding problems repeatedly derailed the project before cameras could roll. The story passed through several studios and production companies, each time stalling at a different stage. When the De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, the company behind several ambitious productions of that era, collapsed financially in the late 1980s, the picture was left without a home once again. It returned to development limbo, seemingly destined to never get made. What makes this chapter of the film's history so remarkable is how close it came to happening multiple times under completely different circumstances. A version starring Swayze and directed by Beresford would have been a drastically different movie, and possibly a far less celebrated one. The turbulent development history that seemed like a curse may, in hindsight, have been the very thing that produced the right combination of talent at exactly the right moment. Number 5. Arnold forced the movie to happen. By the late 1980s, the script had been floating around Hollywood for the better part of a decade. It had survived collapsed studios, director departures, and a string of near misses. What finally broke the deadlock was the sheer determination of one man. Schwarzenegger had been chasing the project for years, convinced it was exactly the kind of film he wanted to make, and he wasn't simply waiting to be cast. He was actively pushing to make it happen. Using the enormous leverage he had built following the success of films like The Terminator and Predator, he persuaded Kuato Pictures to finance the production on a massive scale. The budget that followed was extraordinary for its time, reportedly climbing well above $60 million. He also strongly championed hiring Paul Verhoeven, fresh off the success of RoboCop, as the director best suited to bring the material to life. Verhoeven's ability to blend brutal action with dark satire made him a natural fit. The result was a project transformed. What had spent years as a mid-range sci-fi concept suddenly became one of the most ambitious productions Kuato had ever attempted. Schwarzenegger's insistence on doing the film at scale with the right creative team behind it made all the difference. Without that persistence, the story of Douglas Quaid might never have reached the screen, or might have remained the forgotten footnote of a Patrick Swayze picture that nobody ever saw. Number 6. Gary Goldman deepened the mystery. When people discuss the writing credits on Total Recall, a familiar mistake tends to surface. Many assume that William Goldman, the legendary screenwriter behind Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid and All the President's Men, had a hand in the script. He did not. The credited writer was Gary Goldman, a very different figure, whose contribution to the film was arguably one of its most important creative decisions. Goldman came aboard during the later stages of development and worked alongside Ronald Shusett and Dan O'Bannon to refine the final screenplay. His most significant contribution was strengthening the film's central ambiguity, the carefully constructed uncertainty about whether Quaid's adventure is real or simply a Rekall fantasy playing out inside his mind. Earlier drafts had touched on this idea, but Goldman's rewrites pushed it deeper into the structure of the story itself. The result was a script that operated on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it was a propulsive action film. Underneath, it was a paranoid puzzle designed to make audiences question everything they had just watched. That layered quality is a large part of why the film has aged so well and why the debate about its ending has never truly been settled. Goldman's name may not carry the same recognition as his more famous near namesake, but his fingerprints are all over what made this movie so enduringly fascinating. Number 7. Rekall predicts the whole plot. There is a scene early in the film that deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Sitting in a sleek sales chair at the Rekall facility, Quaid is walked through the details of the memory package he is about to purchase. The technician describes a fantasy trip to Mars, complete with a secret identity, a dangerous mission, and a beautiful woman waiting for him on the other side. It sounds like a sales pitch. It also sounds exactly like the rest of the movie. Every major element introduced during that brief presentation later appears in the story. The double identity, the rebel cause, the romantic lead, the life or death stakes. All of it was laid out in that room before the adventure supposedly began. Fans who subscribe to the "it was all a dream" theory point to this scene as the clearest evidence available. Why would the film describe the entire plot in advance unless the plot itself was the product being sold? What makes this detail so unsettling is that it could be read either way. Believers in the "it was real" interpretation argue that the Rekall technician simply described an adventure similar to what Quaid genuinely experienced, a coincidence born from tapping into his suppressed memories as Hauser. But the other reading is harder to shake. That the Rekall program delivered exactly what was promised, down to the last detail, and the audience watched every second of it play out. The film never tells you which version to believe, and that almost certainly is by design. Number 8. The trailer that almost killed it. Not every battle fought over this production took place on a soundstage. One of the quietest crises of the entire release happened in the editing suite, long after filming had wrapped. The first wave of marketing materials sent to theaters and test audiences reportedly fell flat, confusing viewers rather than exciting them. For a film carrying a budget that had ballooned to extraordinary heights, a weak marketing campaign was not a minor concern. It was potentially catastrophic. Schwarzenegger reportedly stepped in personally to push for a complete rethink of the promotional strategy. He had been close to the project for years and understood better than most what made it compelling. The solution was to lean hard into the spectacle, to lead with the action, the scale, and the relentless energy that define the film's best sequences. New trailers were cut with that philosophy in mind, and the difference was significant. By the time Total Recall opened in June 1990, audiences had a clear sense of what they were walking into. The revised marketing helped generate considerable excitement ahead of the release, and the film debuted at #1 at the box office. It would go on to gross over $260 million worldwide, becoming one of the highest-earning films of that year. The near disaster of those early trailers was quickly forgotten, buried under a box office performance that silenced every concern the studio had ever raised. Number 9. A release date that caused panic. Completing a film of this scale was already a monumental task. What nobody needed was the finish line suddenly moving closer. At some point during post-production, the studio made the decision to push the release date forward, compressing an already punishing schedule into something genuinely alarming. Editors, sound designers, and visual effects artists were suddenly racing against a clock that had been reset without warning. The effects team was hit especially hard. Many sequences were not yet finished when the new deadline arrived, and the work required to complete them was substantial. The X-ray scanner scene, the decompression effects, the miniature work, the blue screen composites, all of it had to be finalized under conditions that left very little room for error. Crew members reportedly worked around the clock during the final weeks, pushing through exhaustion to deliver a film that met the studio's expectations. What is remarkable, given those circumstances, is how polished the final product actually looks. The effects hold up impressively for a film made in 1990, and the editing is tight and purposeful throughout. The panic behind the scenes left almost no visible trace on screen. It is a testament to the professionalism of the crew that audiences sitting in theaters that summer had no idea the film they were watching had been finished under such intense last-minute pressure. Number 10. Mexico City became the future. Finding the right place to build an entire Mars colony is not a straightforward problem. The solution the production settled on was Estudios Churubusco in Mexico City, one of Latin America's largest and most established studio facilities. It offered the space, the infrastructure, and the capacity to house the kind of sprawling, interconnected sets the script demanded. For several months, the studio became the beating heart of an imaginary world set millions of miles from Earth. The sets constructed there were extraordinary in their scale and detail. Designers built entire sections of the Mars colony from scratch: corridors, public spaces, mechanical rooms, and populated streets, all carefully designed to feel like a real, functioning environment rather than a film backdrop. Multiple sound stages were taken over simultaneously, and the production occupied the facility on a scale that few shoots had attempted before. Hundreds of extras moved through these spaces every day, many of them transformed by hours of prosthetic makeup. One of the more unusual production decisions was to film many scenes in narrative sequence, following the story's order rather than shooting for logistical convenience, as most productions do. This gave the cast a genuine sense of escalating tension as filming progressed, allowing the performances to build organically alongside the story. It was an unusual choice for a film of this size, and it added a layer of authenticity to the performances that might otherwise have been difficult to achieve inside such an artificial environment. Number 11. Sets built for endless chases. Designing a film set is usually about creating a convincing backdrop for the story. On this production, the design team took a fundamentally different approach. Rather than building isolated locations that existed independently of one another, the art department constructed sets that physically connected, corridors feeding into tunnels, tunnels opening into larger spaces looping back through side passages. The result was an environment that could sustain continuous movement without the camera ever running out of world to explore. This decision paid off most visibly in the film's chase sequences, which move through the colony with a momentum that feels genuinely relentless. Characters run, fight, and scramble through spaces that feel lived in and geographically real. That sense of physical coherence was not accidental. It was the direct result of a design philosophy that treated the entire colony as a single interconnected organism, rather than a collection of separate locations. Filling those spaces required an enormous supporting cast. Hundreds of extras were brought in to populate the streets and corridors of the Mars colony, and many of them spent hours in the makeup chair each morning before stepping in front of the camera. Rob Botton's effects team created a wide range of prosthetic applications, deformities, unusual features, and physical mutations that transformed ordinary background performers into citizens of a genuinely alien world. The cumulative effect was a colony that felt crowded, organic, and believably imperfect. Number 12. Real desert became Mars. Not everything in the film was built on a soundstage. When the production needed the surface of Mars itself, the crew packed up and headed to Nevada's Valley of Fire State Park, a stretch of ancient red sandstone formations roughly an hour outside Las Vegas. The location had been used in films before, but rarely with such a specific purpose. The deep crimson rock, the jagged formations, and the vast empty sky created a landscape that required almost no alteration to read as another planet entirely. Shooting on location brought a quality that no set construction could fully replicate. The scale was real, the light was real, and the texture of the environment had an authenticity that audiences could feel even if they couldn't quite explain it. When the camera pulls back across the Martian surface during exterior sequences, the weight of that landscape gives the film a visual credibility that grounds even its most fantastical elements. The location footage also served a crucial technical function. Visual effects artists used those real-world plates as the foundation for composite shots, blending the live-action footage with miniature constructions and matte paintings to extend the environment far beyond what the camera could actually see. Matching the color, the light, and the texture of those Nevada exteriors with studio-built elements required considerable skill. When it worked, and it usually did, the scene between reality and artifice became invisible. The desert had become Mars, and the audience was given no reason to doubt it. Number 13. The X rating that shocked studios. Paul Verhoeven has never been a filmmaker who softens his edges. His work on RoboCop had already demonstrated a willingness to push violence further than most mainstream American directors would dare, and Total Recall continued in that tradition. When early cuts of the film were submitted to the MPAA for review, the response was not encouraging. The rating that came back was an X, the classification typically associated with adult content rather than science fiction blockbusters. For a studio-backed production with enormous commercial ambitions, an X rating was close to a death sentence. Major theater chains refused to carry X-rated films, which would have devastated the film's earning potential almost entirely. The filmmakers had no choice but to go back and make adjustments, trimming or modifying sequences throughout the film that had pushed the classification board past its threshold. The process was surgical and uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Verhoeven later acknowledged that the Total Recall rating battle was less grueling than the equivalent struggle he had faced with RoboCop a few years earlier. That film had reportedly been submitted to the MPAA over a dozen times before finally securing an R. By comparison, the Total Recall negotiations moved relatively quickly, and the final cut retained enough of the film's intensity to satisfy Verhoeven's vision. The finished product may have been slightly softer around the edges than his original intention, but only slightly. Number 14. The strange Oscar it won. Award ceremonies have their standard categories and their reliable frontrunners. What happened at the Academy Awards following this film's release did not fit neatly into either. Rather than receiving a nomination in the conventional Best Visual Effects category, the production was honored with a Special Achievement Award, a rare distinction that the Academy reserves for technical accomplishments it considers to fall outside the boundaries of its regular competitive framework. It was an unusual acknowledgement for an unusual film. The award recognized the breadth and ambition of what the effects team had pulled off. Practical effects, large-scale miniature work, early computer-generated imagery, and complex animatronics had all been combined into a single coherent visual language, something that required not just technical skill, but genuine creative vision. The X-ray scanner sequence alone represented a significant leap forward in what CGI could achieve within a live-action context. The decompression effects, the mutant prosthetics, the animatronic creatures, each element had been built and executed at a level that pushed the industry forward. Special Achievement Awards are handed out sparingly enough that receiving one carries considerable weight. Previous honorees had included the sound design of Star Wars and the visual effects of 2001: A Space Odyssey, company that speaks to the significance of the recognition. For a film that had been dismissed in some quarters as pure spectacle, the Academy's acknowledgement served as a formal reminder that the craft behind the spectacle had been genuinely extraordinary. Number 15. The Survival Knife Lawsuit. Behind every major production is a web of contracts, agreements, and creative contributions that rarely make it into the conversation about the finished film. Occasionally, one of those arrangements falls apart publicly, and when it does, the legal fallout can reveal just how complicated the business of filmmaking actually is. During the production of this film, a dispute of exactly that kind worked its way into the courts. A weapons designer came forward with a claim that he had created a survival knife prop used in the film and had been promised a screen credit in return for his contribution. When the finished film was released without that credit appearing, he filed a lawsuit against the studio and the filmmakers involved. The specifics of the case touched on questions of creative ownership, contractual obligation, and the value placed on technical contributions that rarely receive public recognition. The lawsuit highlighted something that big-budget productions often prefer to keep quiet: the sheer number of skilled craftspeople whose work feeds into the final product, and the tensions that can arise when the recognition they were promised fails to materialize. Props, weapons, and technical designs are not simply purchased off a shelf. They are often custom-built to the specific demands of a production, and the people who build them frequently negotiate for acknowledgement as part of the deal. When that acknowledgement disappears, the results can end up precisely where this one did, in a courtroom. Number 16. The 16 seconds that changed CGI. Some of the most important moments in film history last only a few seconds. Blink at the wrong time, and you miss them entirely. The X-ray scanner sequence near the beginning of the film runs for approximately 16 seconds of screen time. A brief, almost throwaway moment in which Quaid passes through an airport-style security arch and the camera reveals the skeletal figures of the people around him. It is visually striking in the context of the film. In the context of cinema history, it was something considerably more significant. The original plan was to achieve the effect using motion capture technology, a process that was still in its early stages and proved too unreliable to deliver the results the team needed. When that approach failed during testing, the effects artist pivoted to a different technique, rotoscoping, in which Schwarzenegger's physical movements were traced and redrawn frame by frame to create the skeleton animation layered beneath the live-action footage. It was painstaking work, and every second of those 16 represented hours of labor. What the team produced was one of the earliest examples of CGI being used to create a photorealistic effect within a live-action film, a moment that pointed clearly toward where the industry was heading. The sequence predates the dinosaurs of Jurassic Park and the liquid metal of Terminator 2 by several years, yet it belongs to the same lineage of technical ambition. 16 seconds that most audiences barely registered at the time quietly helped change what filmmakers believed was possible. Number 17. The giant animatronic disguise. Few scenes in the film are more immediately memorable than the moment a heavyset woman at the Mars spaceport begins to malfunction. The disguise Quaid uses to smuggle himself onto the planet, a large prosthetic head and body built around a mechanical interior, is one of the most ambitious practical effects gags in the movie. It is also one of the most technically complicated, requiring months of design work before the crew had something that would function reliably in front of a camera. The central challenge was creating a mask large enough to fit over Schwarzenegger's body while still being capable of opening convincingly on cue. Early design attempts reportedly struggled to balance the mechanical requirements with the physical scale involved. The final solution was an elaborate animatronic mechanism, a system of hidden motors and carefully engineered joints that allowed the face to split apart in a sequence that lasts only a few seconds, but leaves a lasting impression. Every component had to work together flawlessly because the shot left almost no room for error. The finished scene combined the practical animatronic effect with careful editing to sell the full illusion. What audiences saw was the result of layering, real mechanical movement, precisely timed cuts, and a performance from Schwarzenegger that played the absurdity of the moment absolutely straight. It remains one of those sequences that practical effects enthusiasts point to as evidence of what physical craftsmanship could achieve before digital tools became the industry standard. The woman who was never real somehow became one of the film's most unforgettable characters. Number 18. Ironside's brutal audition. Casting the right villain is one of the most consequential decisions any director makes. A weak antagonist can undermine an entire film, no matter how strong everything else around it is. Paul Verhoeven clearly understood this, and when it came to finding the man who would play Richter, Quaid's relentless pursuer throughout the film, he was not interested in a polished, controlled performance. He wanted something raw. What he got from Michael Ironside reportedly exceeded even those expectations. Verhoeven pushed Ironside hard during the audition, demanding a level of emotional intensity that went well beyond the standard read-through. The director wanted to see what Ironside could access under pressure, whether he could sustain a state of barely contained aggression for the duration of the test. Ironside committed to the performance completely, escalating the intensity until he was reportedly drained and close to tears by the time the audition ended. It was an uncomfortable process for everyone in the room. It was also exactly what Verhoeven was looking for. Ironside brought a quality to Richter that elevated the character well beyond the standard action film enforcer. There is something genuinely unhinged in his portrayal, a personal fury that feels less like professional duty and more like obsession. That quality makes him a far more compelling presence than the role might have produced in other hands. The brutal conditions of the audition room turned out to be the best possible preparation for a character defined almost entirely by his inability to let go. Number 19. The hidden effects in the lobby. Not every visual effect announces itself. Some of the most technically demanding work in a film is found in scenes that audiences pass through without a second thought. Moments that look simple precisely because the team behind them worked so hard to make them look that way. A scene set inside the Mars Hilton lobby is one of the clearest examples of that quiet, invisible craftsmanship at work. The lobby features large windows looking out onto the Martian landscape beyond the building's walls. In practical terms, there was no Martian landscape. What existed instead was a carefully constructed illusion, blue screen panels standing in for the view outside, combined in post-production with miniature landscape models and matte paintings to create the impression of a world stretching away into the distance. The compositing required precision that went well beyond simply placing one image on top of another. The specific challenge that made this scene particularly demanding was lens distortion. The windows through which the Martian exterior is visible have a slight curvature that bends the image in a very specific way. For the composite to work convincingly, every element, the blue screen footage, the miniature plates, the matte work, had to replicate that same distortion exactly. A mismatch of even a small degree would have broken the illusion entirely. That it holds together as well as it does is a tribute to the precision of the effects team, working on a problem that most viewers never knew existed. Number 20. Goldsmith's relentless music. There are film scores that accompany a movie, and there are film scores that drive it. Jerry Goldsmith's work on Total Recall belongs firmly in the second category. From the opening moments to the final fade, the music operates less as background texture and more as a constant forward force, propelling the action, deepening the paranoia, and refusing to allow the audience a moment of genuine stillness. It is one of the most energetic scores Goldsmith produced across a career that spanned 5 decades and more than 200 films. The density of the writing is remarkable. Goldsmith packed an unusual number of musical events into each cue, shifting rhythms, layered textures, and melodic fragments that surface and disappear before they can fully resolve. This restlessness mirrors the film's own refusal to settle. Just as Quaid can never quite trust what he is experiencing, the music never quite lands in a place that feels entirely safe. The tension is built into the structure of the score itself, rather than applied from the outside. What Goldsmith achieved was a piece of work that functioned simultaneously as action music, psychological thriller accompaniment, and something stranger. A sonic landscape that keeps the dream versus reality question permanently open. A score that clearly signaled this is real or this is fantasy would have betrayed the film's central ambiguity. Instead, Goldsmith wrote music that lives in exactly the same uncomfortable middle ground as the story itself. It is, in its own way, as carefully constructed a piece of misdirection as anything in the script. Number 21. The brutal Mexico shoot. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from working inside an enclosed space for months on end. Hot, loud, and filled with artificial smoke. Cast and crew on this production became intimately familiar with that feeling. The sound stages at Estudios Churubusco were enormous, but size offered little relief when the special effects team was pumping atmosphere into the air and the lighting rigs were running at full capacity overhead. The physical demands of the shoot were relentless from nearly the first day of principal photography. The smoke used to create atmosphere in the colony sequences was a persistent problem. It filled the stages quickly and dissipated slowly, leaving cast members and crew working in conditions that were uncomfortable at best and genuinely unhealthy at worst. Several people became ill during the production, and the combination of heat, artificial atmosphere, and the sheer duration of the schedule took a measurable toll on everyone involved. Verhoeven, who was no stranger to punishing shoots, later described it as among the most physically demanding productions of his career. What makes that context worth understanding is the quality that ended up on screen. The performances are sharp, the energy is high, and the film moves with a relentless momentum that never suggests a tired cast or a crew running on empty. Whatever the conditions cost the people who endured them, very little of that cost is visible in the finished film. The Mars colony looks vibrant and alive because the people building it refuse to let the difficulty of the work show. And that kind of professionalism deserves considerably more credit than it typically receives. Number 22. The puppet heads of horror. Among all the effects sequences in the film, few have stayed in the cultural memory as stubbornly as the decompression scenes. The images of faces swelling, eyes bulging, and features distorting under the pressure of exposure to an unprotected Martian atmosphere are deeply unsettling in a way that goes beyond simple shock value. They tap into something primal, a fear of the body failing catastrophically, of the human form losing its integrity in real time. Achieving that effect practically without digital assistance required a different kind of ingenuity. The solution was a set of elaborately engineered puppet heads, mechanical models built to replicate the facial structure of the actors involved, capable of being distorted in controlled ways through hidden internal mechanisms. The effects team designed systems of motors, cables, and pneumatic components that allowed operators to manipulate the faces from off-camera, driving the distortion through pre-planned stages that could be filmed in real time. The level of detail in the construction was extraordinary. Every feature had to behave believably under stress, following the logic of what a face might actually do if the physics were real. The results are among the most effective practical effects in any science fiction film of the era. They hold up not because the technology that created them was sophisticated by modern standards, but because the design thinking behind them was so precise. The puppet heads did not simply swell. They swelled in ways that felt anatomically plausible, which is what gives the sequence its lasting power. Digital tools might have made the process easier. It is far from certain they would have made it better. Number 23. Mutants that pushed limits. Building a believable population of Martian mutants was one of the most creatively open-ended challenges the effects department faced. Unlike the decompression heads or the Kuato puppet, effects with specific technical briefs, the mutant designs required the team to invent a visual language from scratch. What do people look like after generations of exposure to the kind of radiation that saturates an unshielded planet? Rob Bottin's team explored that question across dozens of concept designs before settling on the approaches that made it into the film. The range of results was deliberately varied. Some mutants carried relatively subtle deformities, unusual proportions, thickened skin, asymmetrical features, while others were far more dramatic. Their physical forms reshaped in ways that required full prosthetic bodysuits and hours of daily application. The goal was a colony population that felt genuinely diverse in its mutations, rather than repeating the same visual idea in slightly different forms. Each character required its own design solution, and many of those solutions went through multiple iterations before they were approved. Among the most discussed of those iterations was the design of the three-breasted character, a figure that became one of the film's most recognized images. Several variations were explored before the final version was settled on, and the prosthetic construction required to bring the concept to life was more technically involved than it might appear. What looked like a brief, almost comedic moment on screen was the result of genuine craft work. Bottin's team approached even the film's most outrageous concepts with the same seriousness they brought to everything else, and the consistency of that commitment is visible throughout. Number 24. Kuato needed 15 puppeteers. Of all the characters created for the film, none required more collaborative effort to bring to life than Kuato, the mutant resistance leader who exists as a second body, growing from the torso of a man named George. The concept was as strange as anything in the script, and translating it from the page into something that could perform credibly on camera was a problem with no simple solution. What the effects team eventually developed was one of the most complex puppet systems ever assembled for a single character in a film production. For scenes in which Kuato needed to move through space alongside the actor carrying him, Marshall Bell wore an elaborate prosthetic suit that incorporated the lower portion of the character's body into his own physical form. The weight and bulk of the appliance made movement difficult, and Bell performed those scenes under conditions that required significant physical endurance. For close-up sequences where Kuato's facial expressions and physical gestures needed to be precise, the prosthetic was replaced by a fully animatronic puppet version of the character, a construction of extraordinary mechanical complexity. Operating that puppet required a team of approximately 15 people, working in coordinated silence off-camera. Each operator controlled a specific element: an eyebrow, a lip, a hand movement, the rhythm of the chest as it appeared to breathe. The coordination required to make all 15 contributions cohere into a single, convincing performance was remarkable. Any mismatch in timing or intention would have broken the illusion immediately. That Kuato reads as a genuine character rather than a technical demonstration is a testament to the collective skill of everyone involved in making him move. Number 25. The sequel that became Minority Report. Success on the scale this film achieved almost inevitably produces sequel conversations. By the early 1990s, plans for a follow-up were being actively discussed, and a concept had taken shape around a premise that would have pushed the franchise into new territory. The proposed story centered on mutants who possessed the ability to foresee criminal acts before they occurred, a concept that introduced a legal and moral dimension considerably more complex than the original film had explored. For a time, it seemed as though the idea might actually move forward. It did not. The sequel stalled for reasons that were never fully made public, and the Mars elements of the concept were eventually stripped away and separated from the Total Recall framework entirely. What remained was the core idea: precognitive individuals being used by the state to prevent crimes that have not yet happened, and that idea was compelling enough to survive on its own terms. It found its way into development as a standalone project, and after years of refinement, it eventually reached the screen in 2002 as Minority Report, directed by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Cruise. The connection between the two films is rarely discussed, but it reframes both of them in an interesting way. Minority Report is widely regarded as one of the finest science fiction films of its era, thoughtful, visually inventive, and genuinely engaged with the ethical questions it raises. The fact that its central premise originated as a discarded idea from a Total Recall sequel says something meaningful about the creative fertility of that original production. A franchise that never happened gave the world a different kind of masterpiece instead. The screen fades to white, and the question remains exactly where it has always been: unanswered, unresolved, and deliberately so. Whether Quaid genuinely saved Mars or spent the entire film dissolving inside a Rekall fantasy is a debate this movie was designed to sustain forever. Paul Verhoeven built the ambiguity into every layer of the production, and 35 years later, it still works. What the behind-the-scenes story reveals is a production that was almost as improbable as its own plot. If these 25 secrets gave you a new appreciation for what went into making this film, please like and subscribe to support more videos like this one. And we want to hear from you. Do you believe Quaid's adventure was real, or was it all just a very expensive dream? Drop your answer in the comments below.